I understand myself to be prompted in this case to speak on the topic of big data. And big data is a big topic, and really the main thing I would like to say about it is that it's two topics. I'd like to propose that we would benefit from thinking differently about big data in the sciences versus big data in commerce. And I'd like to focus on some of the differences between the two domains. So let's talk first a little about big data in science. The way I like to talk about big data in science is that it is really magical. It's really astonishing that we can take in data from sensors and from other sources and analyze very large amounts of it effectively. This is something amazing. It's one of the great gifts of the age of computation. And yet, even as it is magic, it's a hard kind of magic. It's not automatic. And in order to understand why I say it's not automatic, one need only consider the familiar examples. So a great commonplace example of big data is weather. We can gather incredible amounts of weather from satellites, from ground sensors, from all sorts of sources. We can analyze the data, and a result of that is improved weather forecasting. And yet, forecasting is not perfect. It's better, but every bit of improvement is hard-won. It's a hard kind of magic. Another crucial point is that despite there being large amounts of data, it took years for a consensus to emerge that global climate change was an authentic phenomenon, and it is still somehow difficult to convey the scientific consensus to the public at large because there's no single smoking gun. So we face both a new scientific process that can take a long time to sort out, and also a new communication process with the general public that is still not sorted out. I'll mention a few other examples of big data in science that I find personally exciting, and they all exhibit the same quality of being incredibly magical and yet a very hard kind, and I mean magic not in a supernatural sense, but just in the sense that it's so thrilling to have such a widened horizon in front of us. That's what I mean. So genomics is another fantastic example. We're in the age of genomics. We can gather huge amounts of data and work with it in ways that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that suddenly whole families of diseases have disappeared from the earth. The progress is slow. The progress is real, and I'm very optimistic that it'll continue, but it's very hard to predict and say, well, just because we have this much human genome data that suddenly on a given year all these diseases will suddenly be gone from the earth. It doesn't work that way. There's real work. My favorite example from the last couple of years is probably from Jack Gallant's lab at UC Berkeley, where he was able to recover what people were seeing by directly observing activity in their brains using big data and statistical methods. The nature of the experiment was actually very simple. He showed subjects a batch of movie clips and recorded functional magnetic resonant imagery of their brains, fMRI data, and then showed them new clips they'd never seen before, and simply correlated how similar their brain's responses to the new clip were to the various previously seen clips, and then differentially mixed in the previously seen clips, and in sufficient numbers what comes out is what the person is seeing. So it's a form of mind reading enabled by big data, something that would have been unimaginable only very recently. And furthermore, the way it came about was more a statistics exercise than anything, and in fact in one case students in a statistics class were able to enter a competition to tweak the algorithms to improve the results. So this is fantastic, and yet if you talk to Jack Gallant or other people involved in the research, they will not say, this is fantastic, we now understand how the brain encodes visual information. Far from it. What they'll say is, this is fantastic because now we have a toehold with which to start doing the real science. This is not the end but a beginning, and now the real work comes. So there's this very strange thing that can happen with big data where you can get this huge payoff early in the game prior to the scientific understanding. So in this case you have this amazing payoff, which is an ability to reconstruct what somebody's seeing just by observing that blood flow in their brain. It's just wild. And yet that precedes the science. And there's a crucial point here, which is to say that if anybody is making the argument that detecting statistical correlations can become a substitute for scientific understanding, they should look at all these cases and see that useful results still require understanding, which takes a long time to generate. I don't think this should be a controversial thing to say, and yet there's some circles, usually not in the sciences, but more in the periphery, more technologists and business tech types who, or tech journalists, who might promote the idea that some sort of correlative artificial intelligence thing can become a substitute for scientific understanding. And I don't think we're seeing evidence of that yet. I think we're seeing just the opposite, that as incredibly valuable as big data is, it's still a tool towards the end of understanding. And that's where we really gain utility. Okay, so that's a snapshot of big data in science. Now let's move to what I feel should be held in a different category, which is big data in business. Now, in terms of the instrumentation and the sorts of professions that might be drawn into it, the professional backgrounds, you see a lot of similarity in these two. I mean, if you go to a big data center at a physics experiment or an astronomy experiment or a genomics lab, you'll see the same kinds of computers and the same recent PhDs from MIT and Caltech, and there's a lot that looks the same, but there's some huge differences. There are differences in practice, in the epistemology, but let me just go through some of them. One of the things is that when you gather data from people, they don't sit there passively as natural data does, waiting to be measured. They're not like the atmosphere or the genomes kind of sitting there. When you measure people in a business context, a significant percentage of them turn into scammers who are fighting back and trying to change the way they're measured for their own advantage. So you're engaged in a world of game theory instead of measurement, which is fundamentally different. Now in the sciences, of course, this isn't entirely unfamiliar. Anyone who does work in the social sciences or in psychology is used to having to trick their subjects into trying to avoid these sorts of biases. And there's a whole world of discipline about that. But in business, it's quite a profound issue which is not even addressed yet from a business perspective, much less a scientific one. So let me give you some examples of what I mean about these populations of scammers. There's so many examples. Google has a huge problem with people gaming their system to get high rank on valueless websites simply because there's a profit motive. So you have a whole world of marginal websites that maybe have a little bit of content but offer very little value that outpace the real websites because they really want to be high on the list of results. You also have completely bogus ones that offer nothing. You also have strange distortions, such as when internal memos at AOL and Huffington Post that directed writers to change the way they wrote in order to appeal to Google's algorithm. So you have this whole world distorting itself, curving itself to look good to the algorithm that sorts it. Natural enough. This is nothing new. This is what people do. Now, Google engineers, of course, have been kept very busy attempting to fight back. And the way they fight back is by tweaking the algorithm and tweaking their policies and all these things. But the problem is that the population of scammers is adaptive and smart and doesn't just sit there waiting. Instead, it fights back. And so there's this constant arms race that if Google works very hard, they can stay a little ahead of, but they can never defeat 100%. There's always a taint there. There's a world of other examples. I could mention the whole world of malware, viruses. These are people fighting back against software developers. Sites that rely on reviews often have fake reviews, and in fact you can, for low cost, buy fake reviews for your product on reviews on commerce sites that rely on reviews. And in every single case, Facebook's announced that I think 87 million was the number. I don't remember. It's a nation's worth of fake accounts exist on Facebook. It just goes on and on and on. So the thing is, humans don't sit there passively. They adapt if it's in their interest to. And so therefore, the whole idea of big data on people is something that still has to evolve the practices that correspond to the small data practices that have always existed in the science of studying people. So in the science of studying people, you use double-blind experiments, you use deception and cognitive science experiments, you use placebos. There are all these techniques. These things don't really fully exist for big data yet, so therefore this is not really science. Now, an interesting question is, given the prevalence of scamminess in network-based business, why are businesses still investing in their kind of big data? And there are a couple of answers to that are interesting. Part of it is that business is not the seeking of truth. Business is the seeking of a workable result, a profit. And because of this gray area between the entertainment world and technology that's arisen with the internet, an enormous amount of high-tech business has taken on the qualities of the entertainment world. So when you have something, a company like Google, one of the big tech companies that's from a business point of view functioning as an ad agency, and Facebook essentially, this upstart that's become big and gone public, competing over approximately the same customer base, you really have dynamics that are not so objective and so hard-edged as either the sciences or many of the types of industrial businesses that have been associated with engineering and science in the past. They're much more like the entertainment and advertising businesses, where there's no sense of taste. Basically, if people respond, that's good enough, and it doesn't matter why they responded. So this brings up an interesting point, which is that if you're running a big data operation as a business, and the business model has something to do with influencing people, getting them to buy through your site, or getting somebody to buy advertising to reach them, or getting them to renew a subscription if it's a dating site, or any of the other business models, you really don't care whether your analysis of the big data was correct so long as the business is working, and the business might work for any number of other reasons that are not the scientific validity of your analysis of your data. For instance, the users or the population you're targeting might be captive to some degree because all their data is tied up in it, if it's Facebook, or because they're tied into it because of their mobile contract, if it's something through a mobile device, or for whatever reason. And everybody in the tech business is trying to make their services sticky, so people have a bit of a hard time leaving, or in some cases a very hard time leaving. And so if you might simply be able to influence people because controlling the data that's right in front of their noses influences their behavior, whether it was ideally placed based on analyzing them or not. The mere positioning is so valuable that even if the analysis is askew, that flaw might be masked or mitigated. So you have all these other reasons you might be succeeding, but there's this sort of fetish for being technical, for the sciences. The tech business world, as much as it's become like an ad agency, still loves sciences, still loves technical people, still loves math. And so you have this sort of fetishistic elevation of the analysis part of the business, even though it can be awfully hard to tell whether it was the analytic results or just the lock-in or the positioning or some other effect that really resulted in the business being successful. And so therefore you can have this sort of strange, I'm tempted to call it zombie science, where you can go on assuming that your analytic results are a source of value and that there's a lot of validity there, even though actually you haven't closed the empirical loop and controlled for all the other reasons your business might be working. Furthermore, I mentioned before how the population of real people out there will be scheming back at you, just if your business is to try to manipulate them by getting the right link in front of them or positioning the right product for them to decide to purchase through you, they're also trying to manipulate you with fake reviews or fake content to get a high result in a rank or whatever it is. But there's also a sort of a positive feedback loop where they might change themselves to just fit in with your system better and make themselves more easily targetable, which I think happens a little bit on dating sites and maybe on Facebook and whatnot. So sometimes you can get a sort of a false positive, and it's not a false. From a business point of view, there's no such thing as a false positive. There's just a positive. If the money comes in, that's positive, and that's it. From a truth-seeking point of view, from the point of view of scientific method, you can have a false positive, but business can't really distinguish between those two. So I guess what I would like to argue for is to stop using the idea of big data as this big rubric to cover all of these practices within businesses like Google that don't really have the structure to close the empirical loop to determine what part of their success is based on scientifically replicable and testable analytic results versus science where that's really all we care about. Science is never, in my opinion, going to just get automatic, and it's very rarely easy. I'll close with just one recent example. Not too many months ago, the big data analysis of some physics experiments seemed to indicate a faster than light phenomenon. And for months, there was this sort of strange preternatural feeling in the physics community, wow, could this be real? Until it finally turned out to be an instrumentation error. A very similar thing happened with a seeming anomaly in the position of some spacecraft that might violate relativity, and that went away when there was close scrutiny. You never see that in business. You don't see businesses saying, well, hey, we made a profit, but after a year of scrutinizing it, we realized that maybe our analytic results weren't quite as valuable as we thought. A business can't afford to go through that degree of self-examination. It would just be impossible. Google can't do that. They'd go out of business. It would cost too much. So what we have to really learn to recognize is the difference between big data applied in the middle of human affairs, which is more like it's a form of communication. If you don't like it, you might characterize it as a form of manipulation. You can formulate it as a kind of economic activity. Whatever it is, it's not science. Even if the machines look the same and a lot of the people who work at them look the same, and even if the vocabulary is the same, we have to learn to distinguish them. One question to ask is if there's some ambiguity about whether the value in internet businesses really comes from analytic results of studying big data, or if it might be other things like positioning and lock-in and all these other things, then why is there such a focus on it? And I mentioned one reason before, which is I think is sort of a fetishizing of the sciences, and which is great for the sciences, of course. So that's part of it. But there's some other things too. One thought I've had is that other people's data, data representing other people, has sort of turned into a virtual currency, if you like, that's traded only at the very highest levels of exclusive investment and power brokerage. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you have people who are very rich often need to invent among themselves new currencies in which to hold wealth and transfer it and create investments. And a great example of that is modern art, which I think Pablo Picasso first cracked this, and then Andy Warhol refined it. But a successful modern artist figures out how to make their works function like a fancy high denomination currency that can be traded, and that's the key. And for our purposes here, I'm not judging that, or I'm not bothering with that, and it's just something that happens. And I think what started to happen around the turn of the century in Silicon Valley, and it already happened earlier in the financial, in the world of finance, is the gathering of spy data dossiers of people at large, of the hoi polloi, became a new form of virtual currency analogous to modern art. Now it's a funny thing because just as modern art can take on a value regardless of whether anybody in particular thinks it's great art or not. It sort of becomes iconic and is able to serve as a high value currency, and it's a different question from its value as art. In the same way, big data can start to function like a high value currency independent of its validity. And this is a sort of an odd thing, but if you gather tons and tons of data, when the chips are really down and you have to be able to get a result from it, it often turns out that you discover you can't. And I'll tell you a great example of that is when a site needs to be able to ferret out underage users. And it turns out it's very difficult to do. And I won't name names here, but some social networking sites have had difficulty doing that, and they complain, well, it's very hard to do it. And of course it's hard because kids are smart and they're able to deceive some stupid server algorithm. But the interesting thing about that is that the whole premise of the business is that there are these brilliant algorithms that can analyze people and accurately target them with ads or propositions for deals of different kinds. And you can't even tell if they're underage. And so it doesn't mean that the whole thing's invalid. It just means that when you really come to a hard test, as you would in the sciences, it often turns out that you're living in a bit of a fantasy, that you have more analytic success than you really do. That's not to say you have none. It's just to say that when it's not when you don't really test your abilities, it's easy to maintain an illusion for a long time. So there's this sudden almost economic worship of gathering spy data about people at large. If you have a lot of data, you can turn it into finance for some. It could be a financial scheme on Wall Street. It could be some sort of a startup. Like if you have dossiers on, 50 million people that you came to through some internet-based scheme, you can probably get money for that from somebody in Silicon Valley these days. So it becomes this high denomination currency of questionable validity. So there's a sort of strange comedy about it. So on the one hand, there's this enormous world of activism, of people concerned about violations of privacy and concerned about these dossiers being kept on us all. And if you really look into the amount of data gathering that's being directed to every person now, it's absolutely extraordinary. The many thousands of monitoring schemes online, if you browse even mainstream websites, the many times you're seen by a camera that's connected to a network with machine vision software of some kinds. The sum of all these things is just gigantic, and yet, despite this extraordinary ogling of everybody, the actual data that comes out of it is of questionable utility, because there isn't really a scientific process of closing the loop and making sure how good the analytic techniques are. So there's this sort of very weird situation of highly valuing sloppy spying. What a weird moment we're in. I don't think this will last forever, but it's a very strange moment in our economic and cultural history, isn't it? The desire of people who gather data is to find themselves in an elevated position in terms of their awareness of the situation, situational awareness, their information visibility. In general, it is true that if you have more information and a better ability to understand it, that will turn into wealth and power somehow, even if you don't know how in advance. Of course, information doesn't necessarily have to be valid or good information, and I suspect there are a lot of people who are collecting bad information who will discover that they actually don't reap that benefit. But an example of the sort of thing that can happen is, let's think about the Amazon price bot, which is looking out at the cost of books everywhere and makes sure that Amazon's never undersold. And so the result of that is that Amazon has the sort of superior perch for gathering information. And if there's some little bookseller somewhere who wants to do a sale or give away a book promotionally or something, the price spot will globally reduce the sale of that book to remove that local information advantage from that. So there's no more local information advantage for that person. So locality kind of goes away. And all you have is this global information advantage because of the superior information gathering capability. So that's how information turns into money, in sort of just one example. One way to think about this extraordinary fetish for business big data is a fantasy, which I don't believe can ever really be achieved in the long term, of turning a business into a Turing machine, approximately, or into a computer. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's ask what we mean by a computer in the first place. So a computer is a sort of a conceit that we apply to some little part of the universe. We draw a frame around some piece of reality, and we say, within this piece of reality, we're going to interpret things as being representations of digital information. And so what that means is we set thresholds. So we say if the voltage is above some amount, it's a 1, and if it's below some amount, it's a 0, or whatever it is, some sort of a scheme like that. And by using the system of thresholds, we can take this piece of reality, which is after all just a part of the same thermodynamic system as anything else, and we can interpret it as being something quite different, a deterministic system. In order to maintain it for any substantial period of time, we have to manipulate it to keep it within the specifications of these thresholds, and that means throwing out waste heat on the environment around it. So that's why computers run hot. Now, in the same way, if you could turn a business into a sort of computer where you're taking in data from the world and you're generating a profit based on analyzing that data, wouldn't that be sweet? And one of the things you see again and again in business schemes that are based on big data is they attempt to remove themselves from any actual activity. So here's what I mean by that. If you're a big data scheme in finance, you do your best never to be the actual deal, but you're always the in-between system for the deal. So if there's some fraudulent security passing through, you didn't do that. Similarly, if you're doing some consumer internet scheme, if there's like copywritten material uploaded to YouTube or something, it's the problem of that person. You're sort of at arm's length and lily white and untainted because all you want to have is that information superiority where you can analyze the data, and the risk is taken by all the other people, the hoi polloi, who are moving through your superior data position. And so this, in a sense, is attempting to make a giant computer as a form of commerce. And the risk that all those individuals are taking that you are able to remove yourself from is analogous to the heat that's given off at the back of a computer. The waste heat that comes about as a result of the work that's needed to maintain the illusion of there being this deterministic system that meets all these threshold requirements. So the problem with doing this is that the whole purpose of a market, the whole purpose of capitalism, is to package risk and reward so that people can hedge them, you know. And if the risk is radiated outward and the reward is funneled into a simulated giant sort of computer system through big data, it makes a market dysfunctional. There's no one capitalism. I have found that capitalism comes in many varieties. I've come to admire Keynes more than I ever did before, and I started to think of him as a computer scientist in the sense that I think he acknowledged the some basic, what we would understand today as some of the properties of an energy landscape in a way that some other economists perhaps don't, in that you can have a local peak in an energy landscape, and you can think of his idea of stimulus as being trying to hop over to a next peak rather than just stay in your local optimization. And I find a tremendous sophistication in his work. And I think the real argument shouldn't be between liberal and conservative economists, but it should be between people who only understand local optimization and people who understand that optimization is a more complex problem, and that there isn't any magic formula for global optimization, but there can be better than local, that you can jump over a valley to a better peak. And I think that's I wish that that discussion were a little drier and more mathematical instead of so charged by the history, because of the history of Marxism and everything, which I think is unfortunate and has really tainted it. I mean, an interesting example of localization for me is the notion of let's say the pirate party and file copying as being the ultimate form of expression and democracy, which is so popular. And recently we've had a file copying church that's apparently gained some sort of legitimacy and visibility in Sweden. And the pirate parties, of course, have been able to gain seats in some European countries. And to me, this is a local optimization, because what you're saying is that the more information is free, the more democracy there is, and that's true for a local peak. But this is very much like a fallacy of certain older experiments in physical production, where if everybody sort of decides through consensus decision making what to produce physically, or if there's some communist party that does it or something, it can seem as though you're approaching some sort of optimum. But in a market system, it just seems that even more happens, and there's like another peak that's better. And I suspect that something like that is also true for information and expression, that a market system for expression would actually produce more and better expression and of more beauty and use to people. But we're obsessed with the local peak of the free and pirate party style, and that's an interesting argument. And because there's such an orthodoxy about the local peak, it becomes hard to talk about that distant better peak. And this is always the problem you run into with people who are obsessed with the optimization they can see in front of their nose. And so in this sense, to me, this sort of what to me are sort of a simplistic sort of conservative or libertarian mindset about the economy, and the sort of simplistic mindset about the super free are both similar, in that they're both attached to this immediate local optimization right in front of them, and failing to acknowledge that the overall landscape of possibility might be more complex. The people who are saying there can't be any stimulus, there can only be austerity, and this is the only path to optimizing the world, sound very similar to the people who are saying we must not monetize information, there can't be any restrictions, there can only be free flow of information, and that's the path to perfect democracy and expression and culture. To me, these people sound almost identical, even though traditionally one would call them, they probably would cluster with conservative and liberal values. But they're really the same. They're both forms of exactly the same mathematical naivete. And I think Keynes was correct in pointing out that a certain kind of courage is needed to explore an energy landscape, and there's a bit of risk-taking and empirical patience that's needed to find better peaks, but they're out there.